In the dusty, dimly lit attic of his grandmother's house, Alex rummaged through boxes filled with forgotten knickknacks and yellowed photographs. The air was stale, a scent of old paper and must lingered, clinging to his nose as he sneezed. The sun outside had long ago disappeared behind the thick grey clouds that had settled over the town, casting an eerie glow through the single small window. His grandmother's stories of the bad old days had always fascinated him, especially the ones about the ghost town of Chernobyl. He had seen documentaries, read books, and heard whispers of the abandoned city. It was a place where time had frozen in the shadow of a terrible mistake. Now a wild idea had taken root in his mind. He wanted to visit it for himself. Alex had been meticulously planning his journey for months. He studied the maps, the weather patterns, and the best times to avoid detection. The allure of the abandoned wasteland was too strong to resist. He had gathered a few essential supplies: a Geiger counter, a sturdy backpack, a camera, and a flashlight. His heart raced as he zipped up his jacket, feeling the weight of his backpack on his shoulders. This was it. He was going to see the remains of the city with his own eyes. The journey to the exclusion zone was long and arduous. The road grew narrower, the trees denser, and the silence grew heavier with each passing kilometer. Alex's excitement waned as reality set in. The desolate landscape stretched for miles, a stark reminder of the lives left behind. The rusty, twisted metal gates that marked the border to Chernobyl loomed ahead. He took a deep breath, the chilly air piercing his lungs, and climbed over the barricade. The world beyond the gates was a tableau of decay. Overgrown vegetation reclaimed the streets, buildings were skeletal, and the once bustling town now lay silent. Alex's footsteps echoed through the empty spaces, each crunch of broken glass or snap of a twig underfoot, making his heart jump. The only sounds were the distant caws of birds and the occasional gust of wind that whispered through the trees. He had read about the research facility, the heart of the disaster, and that was his destination. The facility was a sprawling maze of concrete and steel, a testament to human curiosity and folly. The doors were unlocked, hanging open like a gaping mouth. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and acidic. His flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing peeling paint and faded signs in Cyrillic. The silence was so profound it was deafening. As he ventured deeper, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was off, something that the history books and stories hadn't prepared him for. He heard a faint, shuffling sound, the kind that made his skin crawl. He told himself it was just the building settling, but a part of him knew better. The part of him that felt the eyes upon his back, that made his heart race like a hammer on an anvil. He was about to find out what really lurked in the shadows of Chernobyl. The first zombie appeared around a corner, a grotesque parody of a human being. Its skin was grey and slack, stretched tight over bones that threatened to break through. Its eyes were milky and lifeless, yet somehow it saw him. The creature lurched forward with a guttural growl, and Alex stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. Panic surged through him as he fumbled in his pocket for the knife he'd brought. The zombie's movements were jerky and awkward, but it was fast. Too fast. He managed to get the knife out just as it lunged at him, its teeth snapping shut on empty air. He swung the knife wildly, slicing into its neck. It staggered back, blood spurting from the wound, but it didn't go down. It just kept coming, the light in its eyes never dimming. He had to run. The facility's corridors twisted and turned, a labyrinth that seemed to shift and change as he sprinted through them. The Geiger counter on his hip began to beep erratically, the numbers climbing higher and higher. The zombies grew in number, their moans echoing through the halls. He could feel the radiation burning through his clothes, but there was no time to stop. He had to find a way out. Alex stumbled into a room filled with ancient computers and lab equipment. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from the flickering screens that still blinked with life. There, in the center of the room, was a door. A heavy metal door with a biohazard symbol etched into the surface. He approached it slowly, the beeping of his Geiger counter growing louder with each step. His hand hovered over the handle, heart racing. He took a deep breath and pulled the door open, the metal screeching in protest. The room beyond was dark, and the smell of death was palpable. Alex took a tentative step inside, and his boot sank into something soft and wet. He gagged and shone his flashlight down. The floor was littered with the remains of the researchers who'd been trapped here. The zombies had been feasting. He had to get out. He spun around, but the door was gone, replaced by a wall of decaying flesh and gnashing teeth. He was trapped. The zombies had herded him here, into this room, and now they were coming for him. The real nightmare was just beginning. The first, one stumbled through the mass of bodies, arms outstretched. Alex swung his knife with all his might, aiming for the head. It connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature dropped to the ground, twitching. But more were coming. He couldn't fight them all off. He had to find another way. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help him. He spotted a metal pipe lying in the corner, rusted but sturdy. He grabbed it, feeling the weight in his hands, and swung it at the next zombie that came his way. It crumpled to the floor with a wet thud. He stepped back, his breathing ragged, and took stock of his surroundings. There had to be a vent, a window, something to escape through. The walls of the room were lined with cabinets, their doors hanging open to reveal rows of empty test tubes and broken glass. Alex dashed to one of the cabinets, hoping to find something useful. His heart skipped a beat when he saw a flare gun on one of the shelves, buried under a pile of dust. He snapped it up and checked the chamber. It was loaded. This could be his ticket out. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. As he turned back to face the approaching horde, the floor beneath him gave way with a deafening roar. He plummeted into darkness, the pipe slipping from his grasp. Alex landed hard on a pile of rubble, the wind knocked out of him. He lay there, for a moment stunned, listening to the cacophony of the zombies' cries above. He could feel their footsteps vibrating through the ground, growing closer. He had to move. He pushed himself up, his muscles protesting, and staggered through the darkness. The air was colder down here, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. His flashlight had survived the fall, and he fumbled to turn it on, the beam piercing the blackness. The room was vast and cavernous, with no obvious way out. The only sound was the dull thud of his own footsteps and the distant echo of the zombies' pursuit. As he moved further into the bowels of the facility, the beeping of his Geiger counter grew more frantic. The radiation levels were spiked dangerously high. He knew he couldn't stay down here for long. The walls were slick with something wet and sticky, and the floor was littered with debris. His breathing grew shallow and painful, his chest tightening. He had to keep moving. The flashlight beam reflected off something shiny ahead, and Alex stumbled towards it. It was a ladder, leading up to a hatch in the ceiling. With newfound hope, he began to climb, the metal rings biting into his palms. Each rung was a step closer to safety, to the world above. But the zombies had other plans. The hatch above grew closer, the light grew brighter, but so did the sounds of the undead. He could hear their snarls, their breathing, and the scraping of their nails against the metal. They were almost upon him. He threw the hatch open and hauled himself up, slamming it shut behind him, just as the first zombie reached the ladder. The metal groaned under their weight but held firm, for now. He found himself in a narrow corridor lined with pipes and electrical wires. The air was thick with the stench of burnt insulation and something else, something that made his stomach turn. He stumbled along, trying to find his bearings, the beeps of his Geiger counter, a constant reminder of the invisible killer all around him. Above, the sounds of the zombies grew fainter, replaced by a new, persistent noise, a humming. It grew, louder as he moved, vibrating through the floor and into his very bones. The corridor opened into a large chamber, and the source of the noise became clear. A monstrous machine dominated the room, pulsing with a sickly green glow. It was like nothing Alex had ever seen, a relic from a nightmare. The air was charged with electricity, and he could feel the hairs on his arms standing on end. The walls were covered in a slimy, pulsing substance that seemed to be alive, stretching and contracting with each pulse of the machine. The room was filled with pods, each one containing a twisted, half-human, half-something-else creature. They were connected to the machine by thick, vein-like tubes. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. This was where the zombies came from. This was the true horror of Chernobyl, born not from the radiation but from the madness of mankind. Alex knew he had to destroy the machine. If he didn't, the creatures it spawned would eventually escape and overrun the world. His hand trembled as he reached for the flare gun. He aimed it at the central core, the pulsing heart of the monstrosity before him. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic pulsing and the beating of his heart. He took a deep breath and squeezed the trigger. The flare shot out a streak of light in the darkness and impacted with a deafening boom. The world around him erupted in a cacophony of screeching metal and breaking glass as the machine shuddered and collapsed in on itself. The pods burst open, and the twisted creatures inside writhed and screeched, their limbs flailing. Alex staggered back, shielding his face from the flying shield. The ground beneath him shook, and he knew he had to get out now. The facility began to crumble around him, the walls cracking and the floor giving way. He sprinted through the corridors, the way out of a distant memory. His lungs burned from the radioactive air, and his heart hammered in his chest. The world outside had become a blur of shadow and light as the sun set. The zombies had stopped their pursuit, but the earth itself seemed to be rising up against him. He could feel the heat of the explosion at his back, the pressure pushing him forward. He had to find a way out before the entire complex collapsed. The air grew thick with dust, obscuring his vision, and the smoke made it hard to breathe. His chest felt tight, his legs heavy. The exit was somewhere ahead, just out of reach. With a final surge of adrenaline, he burst through the smoke, the night air cold and sweet in his lungs. He stumbled into the open, the crumbling facility at his back, the dead city of Chernobyl sprawling before him. He had survived, but at what cost? The horrors he'd uncovered would haunt him forever. The silence of the wasteland was now broken by the distant wails of the creatures he had unleashed. His journey into the heart of darkness had changed him, and he knew he could never truly leave Chernobyl behind.